The phone started ringing just after 7 in the morning. The first call I let go to voicemail. The second one too. By the fourth call from a number I did not recognize, I picked up. A woman's voice came through, shaky and rehearsed at the same time, the voice of someone who had worked themselves up to making this call and was determined to get through it. "You need to come," she said. "Your father, he's had a stroke. He's asking for you." I sat down on the edge of my bed without meaning to. My father. I turned the words over slowly. My father, the man who had spent 39 years making sure I understood that I did not exist to him. The man who had once canceled an entire church service rather than be in the same building as me. That man was now lying somewhere in a hospital bed, and according to this woman, he was asking for me by name. I could feel something tighten in my chest that was not grief. It was not relief either. It was something colder and more precise than either of those things, a feeling I had carried so long that I had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing the weight of something you carry every single day. I looked at the wall in front of me. After 39 years. Now. I did not respond to the woman on the phone right away. I said I would need a moment, and I set the phone on the bed beside me and looked at the window. The morning light was coming in flat and gray, and the street outside was making its ordinary sounds. None of it matched what was happening inside me. I kept asking myself the question that had been sitting at the center of every version of this moment I had ever imagined. Why now? Not when I was 8 years old and standing outside the house of a relative who told me he was visiting, waiting on the step for an hour before accepting he was not coming out. Not when I was 14 and wrote him a letter that came back unopened, the envelope still sealed, returned without a note. Not when I was 26 and sent word through a mutual contact that I just wanted to meet him once just to look him in the face. None of those moments were enough to move him. But this moment, the moment when he was the one who needed something, this was when my name finally came to his lips. I picked the phone back up. The woman was still there, waiting. The word that came to me was not grief or forgiveness or relief. The word was convenience. This felt like convenience. More calls came throughout that morning. Different numbers, different voices, same message dressed in slightly different words. One woman said he had been crying and asking for me. A man whose name I did not recognize said my father was not expected to recover fully and that time was short. Another woman talked about family and healing and how this was a chance none of us should waste. I sat with my coffee going cold on the table and listened to each of them with the particular attention of someone who has had a long time to study silence and now finds speaking very easy to see through. What struck me about all of these calls was a specific thing. None of these people had ever called before. Not once in 39 years had a single person from my father's side of the family reached out to ask how I was, to acknowledge that I existed, to say even one word that admitted they knew I was alive and that the situation was wrong. Their silence had not been accidental. Silence that complete, that sustained, that consistent across so many people over so many years, that is not accident. That is a choice. Collective, deliberate choice. And now, because the man at the center of it needed something, they were calling. All of them. One after another. My name is Cynthia Whitaker, and I have spent my entire life being rejected by a man I never chose to need. I want to make that distinction clearly before this story goes any further. I was not simply abandoned in the way that some children are, a father who left and drifted, who perhaps told himself he would come back, who carried some distant guilt. My father's rejection of me was active. It was repeated. It was intentional. He knew I existed from the very beginning. My mother told me that much before she died. He knew, and he made a series of deliberate choices over and over throughout my entire life, to treat that knowledge as something to be managed and hidden rather than something to be faced. I grew up carrying the particular kind of damage that comes not from absence but from active erasure. There is a difference. Absence is painful. Erasure is something else. Tells a child not just that they were not chosen but that they are the kind of person who should not expect to be chosen. That belief followed me through school, through relationships, through everything I tried to build. It was in the walls of every room I ever lived in. The earliest memory I have of trying to reach him is from when I was 7 years old. My mother had pointed him out to me once from a distance, a tall man in a pressed shirt walking into a building across the street. She did not wave. She just pointed and said quietly, "That's your father." I stared at him until he went through the door and disappeared. 4 years after that, I thought about that moment. I had a face. I had a shape. A real person attached to the word father. By the time I was 12, I had found out enough to know where he worshipped. He was a church elder, a man people in his community called with a title that came before his name, a man who preached about responsibility and family and God's grace every Sunday morning. When I was 17, I decided I would go. I stood outside that church on a Sunday morning with my hands shaking and my heart hammering, and I waited. A woman I did not know came to the door and told me the service had been canceled. No explanation. No rescheduling. Just canceled for that Sunday only without notice. I found out later, through someone who knew someone, that he had been told I was coming. Before my wedding, I tried one final time. I was 31 years old and I told myself it was the last attempt I would make, and I meant it. I did not reach out to him directly. I had long understood that direct contact was something he would sidestep and ignore. Instead, I went through a relative of my mother's who had occasional contact with people on his side, a woman named Portia who knew how to pass messages without making them feel like confrontations. I asked Portia to tell him that I was getting married and that I was not asking for much. I was not asking him to stand beside me or to speak or to be introduced to anyone. I was only asking him to come, to sit in a seat somewhere in the church, to be in the same room. Just that. Just presence. Just the simplest possible acknowledgement that I was real and that the day mattered. He did not come. He did not send word. He did not even acknowledge through Portia that he had received the message. He simply was not there, and the absence had a specific weight that day. Heavier than the dress, heavier than the vows, heavier than the flowers that cost more than I could comfortably afford. My husband's name was Patrick. He was not a cruel man at the beginning. Or perhaps he was, and I was too practiced at accepting a certain kind of pain to notice it at first. The marriage lasted 6 years before it broke apart in a way that left me sitting on the kitchen floor of an apartment I could no longer afford, with the sound of a door that had just been slammed still ringing in the walls. Before it ended, there was a particular argument that I still return to sometimes, in the way you return to the thing that finally named what had been true for a long time. Patrick looked at me across the kitchen table with an expression I had not seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but something colder, something that had been sitting underneath the anger for a long time and had finally risen to the surface. He said, "What kind of woman is so easy to leave that even her own father didn't want her?" I gripped the counter behind me. My knuckles went white. I did not say anything because there was nothing to say that would have reached someone who had just chosen to use that against me. But the words did what they were designed to do. The marriage ended 8 months after that argument, though the argument was only the moment when I admitted to myself what had already been true for longer than I wanted to acknowledge. Patrick left in the way of someone who had made his decision carefully and in advance, with quiet logistics already handled. He had moved his important things out over several weeks in small amounts so that the final departure looked smaller than it was. I was 37 years old when he left. My mother had died 4 years before that. I had no siblings. My father was a name I had stopped saying aloud. I sat in an apartment that had too much silence, and I went through the particular process of reassembling a life from what is left after the important things have been removed. I am not going to pretend that period was anything other than what it was. It was very hard. It was the kind of hard that sits on your chest in the early morning and makes it difficult to find a reason to get up at the specific speed that getting up requires. I got through it the way people get through things, slowly, then less slowly, then at a pace that looked from the outside like something approaching normal. I found work that sustained me. I found 2 or 3 people I trusted. I drove to the hospital on a Wednesday afternoon. The weather was overcast and the city looked the way cities look when the light is low, flatter than usual, every color a shade duller than it should be. I parked in the hospital car park and sat in the car for a few minutes. I was not afraid. I want to be clear about that. What I was feeling was not fear. It was something more like the alertness that comes before a meeting you know will matter, the particular sharpening of attention that happens when you understand a situation is significant and you do not want to be caught off guard by any part of it. I took the lift to the 3rd floor and followed the signs to the correct ward and found the room number I had been given. Before I reached it, I could already hear voices from inside, the low murmur of a group of people gathered in a small space. I stopped outside the door for a moment and listened. I could not make out words, just the general tone, which was the tone of people being careful with each other and the way people are when a situation is fragile. I pushed the door open and walked in. The room was full. Chairs had been brought from somewhere and arranged around the bed. There were perhaps 8 people in the space. The man in the bed was smaller than any version of him I had ever built in my imagination. I had spent 39 years constructing a mental image of my father from the few pieces I had. The distant glimpse at 7, the outline of a man walking away, the second-hand descriptions from people who knew him. In my mind, he had accumulated a certain size over all those years, the way people do when they have shaped your life without ever being present in it. But the man in the bed was small. He was thin in the way of someone whose body has recently been doing something very difficult. There were tubes at his wrist, and the light in the room made his skin look gray and papery. His eyes were open. They moved to me when I stepped forward, and I watched the movement of his eyes carefully, the way you watch for something specific when you have been preparing for a moment for a very long time. I had thought I would feel something overwhelming when I finally looked at him. I had expected the feeling to be large and unmanageable. Instead, what I felt was clarity. Not warmth. Not grief. Not the complicated tenderness I had once allowed myself to imagine might exist between us if we ever stood in the same room. A woman on the far side of the bed, heavy-set in her 50s, wearing the careful expression of someone who has appointed herself to manage the situation, leaned toward me and spoke in a low and gentle voice. "Go ahead," she said. "He's been waiting for you." She said it the way you say something you have decided in advance, with the particular smoothness of a sentence that has been prepared and rehearsed. She gestured toward the bed with an open hand as if she were introducing me to a room I had just rented. I looked at her. I looked at the other faces in the space. I looked at the expectations sitting in this room like a piece of furniture, solid, assumed, not up for discussion. They had built a narrative around this moment before I arrived. The narrative was, she comes, she weeps, she forgives, he receives comfort, the family is whole, the story ends cleanly. I could see the whole architecture of it in the way they were positioned in the room, in the way they looked at me, in the tone of the woman who had just told me he had been waiting. Waiting. 39 years of not waiting had ended apparently this week, and now I was supposed to receive that as meaningful. I looked back at the man in the bed. He had not spoken. I took a step back. Not a large step. Not a dramatic one. Just a small, deliberate shift of my weight away from the bed, toward the door behind me. The room noticed. I could feel it register in the air, the slight confusion, the adjustment of everyone's expectation, the moment when the script they had prepared began to misalign with what was actually happening. The woman who had been managing the situation frowned very slightly. Someone else shifted in their chair. I looked around the room with an expression I had worked on for years without knowing I was working on it. Calm, steady, completely controlled. Then I spoke. "I will speak with him," I said. My voice came out at a normal volume, which in the sudden quiet of the room felt very present. "But I have one condition." Pause after those words was the kind of pause that fills a room completely. No one spoke. No one moved. The man in the bed continued to look at me. I held the silence for a moment longer because I had learned over the course of my life that the person who is comfortable in silence holds the ground in any conversation. Then I looked at the woman who had been managing things and I said, "One condition. And I need everyone to understand it before we go any further." The room was very still. "I want the truth," I said. "Documented." Recorded. No interruptions from anyone in this room while he speaks, and no editing afterward. Several things happened at once. Two people looked at each other with expressions that conveyed an entire conversation in under a second. The managing woman opened her mouth. Someone near the window made a sound that was not quite a word. I did not raise my voice. I did not become defensive or sharp or emotional. I simply said what I had come to say in the order I had decided to say it, with the patience of someone who has already decided they are prepared to wait as long as the situation requires. I have waited 39 years, I continued. I have asked for him my entire life. I am here now. What I am asking for is simple. A recording. His words. Truth about why things happened the way they did. That is my one condition for staying in this room. The managing woman said something about dignity and privacy. A man near the door said something about respect. I looked at each of them in turn as they spoke and I let them finish, and then I said, "Where was the conversation about dignity when I was standing outside a church at 17 years old that had just been locked because he knew I was coming?" The family did not fold all at once. People rarely do. What happened was a more gradual process, a series of small retreats disguised as consideration, a slow movement from resistance toward reluctant acceptance that none of them wanted to call surrender. The managing woman conferred in a low voice with the man near the door. A younger woman, perhaps in her late 20s, her relationship to me unknown, looked at the man in the bed with an expression that suggested she was asking him something without speaking. He did not appear to respond in any visible way. I stood in the same position I had been in since I spoke, which was to say, still, grounded, unhurried. I was not performing patience. I genuinely had it. 39 years of being told to wait, explicitly through locked doors and unanswered letters and absent seats at important occasions, had given me a relationship with waiting that most people do not develop. I had learned that patience, genuine patience, is not passive. It is a form of strength. It holds ground that urgency gives away. The managing woman turned back to me and began a sentence about her concerns and her need to protect the situation. I listened to the whole sentence. Then I said, quietly and without any heat in my voice at all, "I traveled to be here." A recording device was placed on the table beside his bed. I do not know whose it was. Someone produced it from a bag without much ceremony after the decision had been made, which told me that someone in that room had understood, perhaps before the others, that this was where things were going. The atmosphere in the room had shifted completely from the moment I had stated my condition. The warmth, that performed, slightly hollow warmth that had greeted me when I walked in, was gone. What remained was something more honest, which was tension. Real tension. The kind that exists between people when the surface of a situation has been removed and what is underneath is visible. Several relatives had chosen to leave the room. 3 remained. The managing woman, the younger woman from before, and a quiet older man who had said nothing from the moment I arrived. The man in the bed had not moved significantly throughout any of this. He had watched the conversation the way someone watches something from behind glass, present, aware, but separated by something they cannot remove. I looked at the device on the table. I looked at the 3 people remaining. I looked at the man in the bed. He was watching me with an expression I could not fully name, not fear exactly, not grief exactly. Something between the two. I asked my first question in a voice that was steady and unhurried and deliberately simple. I had thought about how to ask this for a very long time. Not the words exactly, the words came naturally, but the register. The tone. I did not want it to sound like an accusation. I did not want it to sound like a plea. I wanted it to sound like what it was, a question that deserved an answer. "Did you know I was your daughter?" I said. The room was completely still. The managing woman was sitting very upright. The younger woman had her hands in her lap and was looking at the wall. Quiet older man was watching the floor. And the man in the bed, my father, the man I had spent 39 years trying to find and understand and reach, looked at me for a long moment with the particular expression of someone for whom the moment of reckoning they have avoided their entire life has finally arrived and there is nowhere left to turn. He moved his head. Slowly. A nod. Yes. There was no confusion on his face. There was no effort to misunderstand the question. There was no fumbling for words that might soften the truth into something else. I let the silence after the nod exist for a moment before I asked the next question. I did not rush. Rushing would have been for my comfort, and I was not here for comfort. I was here for truth. Then why did you reject me? I said. My voice came out steady. I am still slightly surprised by that when I think about it, that after 39 years of this question living inside me, after all the ways it had expressed itself as grief and anger and shame and the kind of loneliness that does not go away no matter how many people you put around it, the moment I finally asked it aloud, my voice was steady. He took a long time to answer. The managing woman shifted slightly. No one spoke. And then, slowly, piece by piece, in the halting and incomplete way of a man whose stroke had affected his speech and whose courage had, I suspected, always been partial even before that, he answered. Image. Reputation. The life he had already been building when my mother became pregnant. The understanding he had reached with himself, apparently without much difficulty, that some situations were easier managed from a distance. He had a standing in his church and community that depended, in his view, on a certain presentation of his life. I was not part of that presentation, so I had been removed from it. The sound that went through the room after he finished was not loud. It was barely a sound at all, more like the adjustment people make when something has landed in a way they were not prepared for. I heard it from the woman beside the bed. I heard it from the older man near the door. What was significant about those sounds was not their volume but their quality. They were not the sounds of people hearing something they already knew being said aloud. They were the sounds of people hearing something for the first time. The managing woman's face had changed. Whatever she had understood about this man, whatever version of him she had carried and maintained and defended, was visibly shifting. The younger woman had turned from the wall and was now looking at her hands in a way that suggested she was deciding something. The older man had raised his eyes from the floor and was looking at the figure in the bed with an expression I could not fully read but which did not look like the expression of someone who was unaffected. Something was happening in that room that none of them had anticipated when they called me. They had expected my arrival to be the difficult part. I had one more question. I had known since I decided to come to this hospital that if I got this far, if the condition was accepted, if the recording was running, if he had answered the first two questions, there was one more thing I needed to hear him address. Not for vengeance. I want to be clear about that. Not for the satisfaction of watching him answer. But because there is a specific kind of not knowing that lives in you when the person who should have looked for you never did, and it is different from the pain of being rejected. It is its own particular shape. Did you ever try to find me? I asked. Did you ever, in any of these 39 years, make any attempt, to know how I was? The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. The others had been the silence of preparation, of a man gathering himself to answer. This one was the silence of the answer itself. He did not move for a long moment. Then, very slowly, he moved his head from side to side. A faint shake. No. He had not tried to find me. He had not wondered at any point in 39 years in any way that translated into action how I was. He had made his choice and then he had left it alone. For 39 years, I said, I chased you. I was a child who stood outside your church. I was a teenager who wrote you letters that came back unopened. I was a woman who asked for one seat at my own wedding and could not get it. I chased you through every stage of my life, and every time I reached for you, you moved further away. My voice was still steady. Did not feel like an act of strength anymore. Just felt true. Today you called me. Your family called me. Everyone who spent 39 years helping you ignore me called me, one after another, this week. I looked at him. Today, for the first time, you chased me. The room was completely silent. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. Some things do not need to be said loudly to be heard in every corner of a room. He was looking at me from the bed with an expression I had spent 39 years imagining, the expression of a person who is finally fully seeing the person they spent a long time refusing to see. I held his gaze. I let him look. I did not look away. I had spent 39 years wanting to be seen by this man, and now that I was not going to flinch from it. The managing woman moved toward me after a moment. She sat down in the chair beside mine that had been empty throughout the conversation, and she put her hand on my arm and spoke very quietly, the way people speak when they believe they are doing something kind. "Stay," she said. "He needs you here. After everything, after finally hearing the truth, stay. Be with him." I looked at her hand on my arm. I looked at her face. She was not, I thought, a bad person. She was a person who had decided a long time ago to arrange herself around this man's version of his life, and she had gotten very good at it, and now she was applying the same skill to the current situation. She was trying to arrange things into a shape that allowed everything to resolve without further difficulty. "He needs you," she said again. I removed her hand from my arm gently and I stood up. "He needed me 39 years ago," I said. "He needed me at 8 and 14 and 17 and 31. He needed to be someone who was capable of choosing his child over his image when his child was a child." I looked at him in the bed. He was still watching me. "He made his choices then," I said. "I am making mine now." I picked up my bag. I had not planned in advance what would happen to the recording. I had focused so completely on the condition and the conversation itself that the question of what came after had existed only as a general intention. The truth should not disappear. It should not be managed back into silence by the same people who had spent 39 years maintaining a different kind of silence. That was as specific as my thinking had been when I walked into that room. What actually happened was not something I orchestrated. The recording had been made in front of witnesses. Several of those witnesses were people who had not known the full truth before that afternoon. People who carry new information do not always contain it, and the people in my father's community were not strangers to conversation. The truth moved the way truth moves when it has been held down for too long and is finally released, not in a rush, not dramatically, but steadily through the connections that already existed. The community that had given my father his title and his standing and the respectful address that preceded his name for decades began to have conversations that had not been possible before. No one made accusations. No one needed to. His own words were available. His own admission, in his own voice, witnessed by his own family, was the only evidence that mattered. I glanced back once before I left the ward. I had not planned to. It was not a dramatic gesture or a calculated final look. I was at the end of the corridor near the lift and something made me turn my head back toward the room I had come from. Through the small window in the door I could see him. The angle was narrow and the glass was reinforced with wire and the distance was enough that his features were not fully clear. But I could see that he was turned toward the door. He was watching the space where I had been, or perhaps the space I was about to leave, or perhaps nothing. Perhaps he was simply pointed in that direction the way people are pointed toward things that have just left. From that distance, in that light, he looked very small. Not diminished by me. Not destroyed by anything that had happened in that room. Just small, the way people look when the thing they have spent their life protecting turns out to be less substantial than the life they spent protecting it. I turned back toward the lift. The button was already illuminated. The doors opened. I stepped in and watched the corridor disappear as the doors closed, and I felt something that I had not felt since before I could remember feeling it. I felt like a person who had finished something. I drove home from the hospital in the same gray afternoon light I had driven through on the way there. The city looked the same as it had, flat, ordinary, its colors exactly what they were. But something about the way I was sitting in the car was different. I noticed it at a red light about 15 minutes into the drive. My shoulders were not in the position they are usually in. I carried tension in my shoulders that had been there so long I had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing something that has always been present. It was not completely gone. But it was different. Less dense. I thought about what I had told myself when I decided to go, not for the reason they think. I had gone because I needed to close something, not in the sense of forgiveness or healing or the warm narrative of reconciliation that the people in that room had been prepared to perform, but in the simpler, more structural sense of refusing to let the story end on his terms. He had spent 39 years writing a version of our story in which I did not exist. I had walked into that room and I had required him to add his own chapter in his own words with witnesses. That chapter existed now. I could not undo the 39 years. No one could do that. He spent 39 years refusing to see me. Not absent, refusing. There is a weight in that word that took me most of my life to put down, and putting it down was not a single moment. It was a long, slow process that happened in the ordinary spaces between the dramatic ones, in the quiet of my apartment, in the steadiness I built in the years after my marriage ended, in the work of becoming a person whose foundation was built on what she knew about herself rather than on what one man had chosen to believe about her. I went to that hospital because I needed the truth to exist somewhere other than inside me. I needed it witnessed and recorded and present in the world. I needed him to say it, not for my sake alone, but because 39 years of a lie requires a truth of equal weight to balance it. I did not go to hurt him. I did not go to destroy him. I went because I had spent my entire life being the one who sought and waited and hoped, and I needed the last chapter to be one I had written. He looked at me from that bed and he finally fully saw me.